I've been a huge Paul Thomas Anderson fan for as long as I've been a film fan. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that Anderson made me a film fan. With one battle after another currently in cinemas, I wanted to look over all of Anderson's films again and share my thoughts and feelings on them. Hard Eight. Hard Eight might be modest when compared with what Anderson would later do. It would only be a few years before he would direct a sprawling 3-hour ensemble piece, but it is more than a mere sign of things to come. I was worried that Hard Eight might feel a little immature. Anderson was only 26 when this film came out, and watching it again all these years later, it didn't feel obviously youthful. If there is one thing that suggests Anderson's youth, it is that Hard Eight feels more informed by Anderson's film watching than life experience. There's a very clear Scorsese influence. Casino only came out the year before. At the same time, Hard Eight does feel like a product of the 90s indie film boom. There is a hint of Soderbergh here, and maybe even a bit of Tarantino. There are some lovely small details that give the film a real lived-in feel and help it feel distinct. We see John, played by John C. Reilly, Velcro his shoes in the first part of the film. It's a brief but very evocative detail. It implies that John has no money for a proper pair of shoes, but also suggests a kind of arrested development, as if he is still a child who hasn't learnt to tie his laces. I like the low-stakes crime premise, mostly set in the unglamorous casinos of Reno. It adds colour to the sad and desperate characters that make up the film, and reminds us how often these kinds of characters appear in Anderson's work. They're just looking for some basic luxuries, whether it is a comfy bed, a hot shower, or a cooked meal. It is interesting to see the paternal relationship between Sidney, played by Philip Baker Hall, and John. John almost feels like Sidney's loyal dog, following him around and looking to him for guidance. The motif of found families and paternal stand-ins is something Anderson has returned to several times over the last 30 years, and it is intriguing to see it here in his first film. Hard Eight has a very showy cast for a debut feature. To have Samuel L. Jackson, who appeared in Pulp Fiction just 2 years prior, and Gwyneth Paltrow in supporting roles highlights just how much buzz there was around Anderson at this early point in his career. His short Cigarettes and Coffee, which Hard Eight is expanded from, received a lot of praise at Sundance. Supposedly Anderson funded the short with money he earned from gambling. I've no idea if this is true, but it is one of those fun stories that I hope is. Overall, this is an accomplished and confident debut from Anderson. It may not rival his later work, but is worth watching in its own right. Boogie Nights. Like Hard Eight, Boogie Nights takes inspiration from a short Anderson had previously made. The Dirk Diggler story was made back in 1988 when Anderson was just 18 years old, and a decade later would serve as inspiration for Anderson's breakout film. This in many ways feels fitting, as Boogie Nights is a film that draws from the American cinematic tradition and is informed by pre-existing film archetypes and tropes. It is one of those films where you can really feel the director's love of film. The influence of Scorsese is even more apparent here than it was with Hard Eight. The characters and narrative are very Scorsese. If you took Goodfellas and replaced the gangsters with adult film actors, you'd more or less have Boogie Nights. The final scene where Dirk rehearses lines in his dressing room mirrors a similar scene at the end of Raging Bull and is likely a homage to Scorsese. The ensemble cast and sometimes sprawling nature of the story draw comparisons with Robert Altman, in particular Nashville and The Player. Anderson has said that Altman's work is ingrained in his DNA and would later act as standby director for Altman's final film, A Prairie Home Companion. Boogie Nights opens with a 3-minute tracking shot that is reminiscent of the opening tracking shot in The Player. It is a very showy start to the film and a clear indication that Anderson saw Boogie Nights as an opportunity to prove his worth as a director. While on the surface the film's themes, the travails of money, the consequences of excess, the dangers of ego and self-aggrandizement are very Scorsese, I don't think Anderson has a clearly defined worldview at this point in his career. These ideas are not seen through the lens of sin, violence, grace, and redemption in the way that Scorsese treats them. While we see the consequences of the characters' lavish, hedonistic lifestyles, there isn't an underlying sense of morality in the way you might get in a Scorsese film. I actually think there is more of a Tarantino influence on Boogie Nights than usually acknowledged. While there are some similarities in terms of shot making and writing, it is on a philosophical level that I really see the comparisons. Tarantino's view of the world is shaped by film and other visual media. His films take inspiration from other films. I don't see Boogie Nights as sociological or as a commentary on the period it takes place in, but rather as a riff on the American filmmaking tradition. This is ultimately a film about filmmaking, even if Anderson gives it a provocative spin. Anderson, as we will see, likes to set his films at turning points in history. Boogie Nights is one of these films, but I'm unsure if he's making a comment on the times or a more general comment about the shifting of culture and the risks of being left behind. Actors, and in particular adult film actors, really feel the passage of time. It very much defines the kinds of roles they get and whether opportunities are available or not. The film shifts tone after the New Year's party that brings in the 1980s. It could maybe be argued that the film is commenting about the move from the more liberated 1970s to the more culturally regulated 1980s. Pictures of Ronald Reagan can be seen in the back of a couple shots, but I personally think this is a bit of a stretch. I actually think there is a stronger argument to be made that this is instead a commentary on the film industry. A lot is made of the shift from adult film theatres to home videotape, and the impact this will have on the way that Jack Horner, played by Burt Reynolds, and co go about their business. There's just enough pathos to keep the film grounded and give it dramatic weight. Julianne Moore's Amber Waves is perhaps the most fully realised character. She is a bit older than the other actors and assumes a maternal presence over them, the idea of found families coming up again in Anderson's work. If I had one criticism of Boogie Nights, it is that many of the characters feel a bit one note. Amber Waves aside, they don't really feel like real people. They feel like the kind of characters you only see in films. When Dirk, played by Mark Wahlberg, compares himself to Napoleon, it is very much played for laughs and not part of a wider look at his unchecked ego. That being said, while many of the characters may be caricatures, I was invested in their lives and felt their successes and pain. By the end of the film, I really felt like I'd been on a journey with them. Boogie Nights might exist in a world of film tropes and archetypes, but it is a brilliantly constructed world. Anderson certainly matures as a director from here, but watching Boogie Nights, it is not a surprise that he has gone on to have the career he has had. Magnolia. There's a very natural progression from Hard Eight to Magnolia. Hard Eight is the accomplished, if self-contained debut that showed that the then 26-year-old Anderson knew what he was doing. Boogie Nights is the ambitious follow-up. We then get Magnolia, an even more ambitious 3-hour ensemble piece that weaves together a number of different stories and characters. Given its ensemble structure, it would be easy to describe Magnolia as Anderson's homage to Robert Altman. Comparisons can be made to Nashville and in particular Shortcuts, but structure aside, I personally think Magnolia is a very different beast to anything Altman ever made. It is finely constructed in a way that very few films are. The way it moves between different stories and perspectives, sometimes touching in with half a dozen different characters over the space of just a couple minutes, is very impressive and must have required a vast amount of planning and thought. And all of this is done with a huge amount of intensity and drama. Magnolia is often described as operatic, and it is easy to see why. More than anything, though, at its heart, Magnolia is a very postmodern film. It feels like Anderson took soap opera and daytime television storylines and filtered them through the high culture lens of Altman and Scorsese. In this sense, parallels can again be made with Tarantino. Tarantino has spoken about Pulp Fiction being a reworking of tired and cliched stories that we've all heard before. Anderson seems to be doing something similar here, except he is pulling from soap opera storylines. It is interesting that during his 2 terms at Emerson College that Anderson was taught by David Foster Wallace, whose novel Infinite Jest is perhaps the best known expression of 90s postmodern concerns and dissatisfaction. Magnolia is part of this broad postmodern tradition, one that looks at the existential struggle for meaning and connection in the age of technology and corporate life. In this sense, it does feel rooted in the late 90s and the critical examinations of the triumph of market capitalism and Western culture. 1999, the year Magnolia was released, was also the year of the cubicle film. Office Space, The Matrix, American Beauty, and Fight Club were all released that year and concerned themselves with characters with respectable corporate jobs that had everything they could want in a material sense, but lacked purpose and emotional fulfillment. For me, Magnolia fits alongside the cubicle films of this time. Phil, the nurse played by Philip Seymour Hoffman, is probably as close as Magnolia gets to an emotionally stable and fulfilled character. There is often a stigma towards male nurses, but despite this, Phil is the only adult character that is undeniably a good person. And then there are the frogs. The film opens with three tales of coincidence. Then, in the final act, frogs fall from the sky, and we're reminded of the three tales and told that unlikely coincidences happen all the time, or at least they do in film and TV. I personally don't think we are meant to believe in the frogs outside of the film. I see them as a meta commentary on the contrived and unlikely nature of film storylines. If we can suspend belief when watching Star Wars or an over the top soap opera, then why can't we believe that frogs can fall from the sky in a film as impressively constructed as this? Signs saying Exodus 8, verse 2 appear at least twice in the film. This is a Bible verse that reads, "If you refuse to let them go, I will send a plague of frogs on your whole country." It is hard to know how deep this reference is meant to be. It could be a comment on the nature of belief, or it might just be Anderson being a smartass. I'm inclined to say the latter, but Magnolia is a fascinating film to deconstruct. As a viewing experience, I do find Magnolia a little relentless. I still enjoy the film, but its almost exclusive look at miserable people can become a bit oppressive. These characters are super lonely and sad, even by Anderson standards. Overall, Magnolia has held up exceptionally well. It is an excellent counterpoint to Boogie Nights. Boogie Nights might be the more entertaining film, but there are few films as overrun with ideas and cinematic flourishes as Magnolia. Punch Drunk Love. When I first saw Punch Drunk Love almost 15 years ago, there was still an air of suspicion around it. This was around the time Grown Ups was released, and a time when I, like many cinephiles, felt we were above Adam Sandler. The idea of highbrow Sandler and his bi-decade appearance in an awards-worthy film was yet to take shape, and Punch Drunk Love, by association, felt like the black sheep of Anderson's filmography. It is funny to think now that it is quite common for film fans to proclaim Punch Drunk Love as their favourite Anderson film. I may not hold this opinion myself, but I can recognise that this is an excellent film and essential to Anderson's evolution as a filmmaker. There are two ways that Punch Drunk Love is usually discussed. The first is as an elevation of the Adam Sandler formula and character. Sandler definitely plays a more complex character here, whether it is the sadness that lies beneath his awkward exterior or the pain caused by his domineering, bullying sisters. The second way that Punch Drunk Love is seen is as Anderson's idiosyncratic take on the rom-com, some deconstructed in a similar way to what I did with Magnolia. I personally don't see this as a rom-com, mainly because it isn't particularly funny. Where there should be jokes, there is awkwardness and sometimes bursts of anger. For me, it is more interesting to simply see Punch Drunk Love as a Paul Thomas Anderson film. It feels like Anderson moving towards his own cinematic language and view of the world. This is a film shaped by Anderson's own aesthetic preferences and view of life, rather than one shaped by film history and cinephilia. The influence of Scorsese and Altman that is so apparent throughout his early films gives way to something stranger and less defined. It is from Punch Drunk Love onwards that the rhythm and grammar of Anderson's work changed. They became more off-kilter and pulled from a more diverse group of influences. Punch Drunk Love also represents Anderson's move away from ensemble pieces towards character studies. After watching Magnolia, I was left considering postmodern theory and film history. After watching Punch Drunk Love, I was left wondering if Barry, played by Sandler, is a good person. I was left wondering if the love story at the heart of the film is romantic or full of red flags. The question at the centre of Punch Drunk Love is much more personal. Can we overcome our emotional issues and find love? In this sense, Punch Drunk Love does act as a coda to the first part of Anderson's career. These films are filled with lonely and sad people who are desperate to find someone who will understand and love them, and here Anderson gives us just that. While Punch Drunk Love is not my favourite Anderson film, it might be the most important in terms of his evolution as a director. There Will Be Blood. When The Brutalist was released, there were arguments about whether it was a great film or if it just had the presentation and grand aesthetics of a great film. It is interesting to look back at the initial reactions to There Will Be Blood and see that the same discussions took place then. Now, more than 15 years on from its release, I can categorically say that There Will Be Blood is a great film. It is widely regarded as Anderson's greatest work and is frequently ranked among the best films of the century, if not of all time. There is a special place in my heart for this film. I first saw it as a 13-year-old on an overnight flight, and despite the small screen, it blew me away. It was the first film that showed me what cinema could be. I sometimes get nervous when I rewatch films I loved as a teenager. There is always the risk that you don't connect with it in the same way. From the first few seconds of my most recent rewatch, I knew this wasn't going to be the case. There Will Be Blood is the kind of film that gets into your bones, that speaks to your soul in a brutal Old Testament kind of way. It slowly builds and becomes something all-consuming. It has the muscular quality of films like Red River, The Treasure of the Sierra Madre, and The Searchers. Its influences are more classical than previous Anderson films. There Will Be Blood brings to mind the work of John Ford, Howard Hawks, John Huston, and maybe even John Steinbeck. It is funny that when Anderson speaks about this film, he talks about it as if it's merely a character drama. In a sense, this is correct. To understand Daniel Plainview, played in incomparable fashion by Daniel Day-Lewis, is to understand There Will Be Blood. Plainview could easily have been a pantomime villain, but Anderson and Day-Lewis portray his inner workings with such detail and insight that he becomes a fascinating character and symbol for early American capitalism. It is a two-faced nature of Plainview that fascinates me most. In a speech early in the film, he describes his enterprise as a family business. In the film's penultimate scene, Plainview reveals to his son H.W. that he is in fact an orphan and says, "I needed a sweet face to buy land." He repeatedly describes himself as an oil man, an attempt to create an air of reliability in the age of prospectors. He presents the image of a responsible and moral businessman to cover his hatred and evil actions. In one of the film's most quoted scenes, Plainview says, "I have a competition in me. I want no one else to succeed. I hate most people." It's illustrative of how greed and the desire for money has carved out his soul, leaving little left behind. This may also be a critique of capitalism and conservative political philosophy, which sees competition and market economics as the key to a free society. When Plainview speaks to the residents of Little Boston, where his main well is erected, he talks about bringing irrigation, schools, employment, and roads to the town. In essence, he is promising the future. He is promising to bring modernity. I don't think Anderson is trying to deny the progress of the last 100 years, and I think he may even have a begrudging respect for Plainview. He does show Plainview's back-breaking early days as a prospector. Instead, Plainview and his oil wells feel like a double-edged sword. They can bring the future, but they can also destroy it. It would be easy to look at preacher Eli Sunday, played by Paul Dano, and try and find salvation there. But he is more of a shaman than a preacher. His services feel like performances. Plainview even comments after one of Eli's services, "That was one goddamn hell of a show." Eli is not an evil man in the way that Plainview is, but they are closer than he would like to admit. In the scene after Plainview pushes Eli into the oil-soaked ground, Eli jumps across the dining room table and does the same to his father. When Eli needs money at the end of the film, he comes to Plainview and repeatedly refers to them as brothers. The only time Eli really gets the upper hand on Plainview is during his baptism. He calls Plainview out for his sins, with the extraordinary scene climaxing with Plainview shouting, "I've abandoned my child." In true Plainview fashion, he only agreed to get baptized for personal gain. Bandy will only let Plainview run his pipeline through his land if he gets baptized. And after the humiliation of the baptism is complete, Plainview says, "There's a pipeline." It is a moment that brings so much of the film together. Plainview, who spends most of the film battling for control, agency, and power, is willing to give it up in exchange for his fortune. At the same time, this is a humiliation that will not be forgotten. In the film's final scene, Plainview enacts his ugly, brutal revenge. There is a subtext to earlier Anderson films, but it is usually reflexive and a commentary on film and media. From There Will Be Blood onwards, his work starts reflecting the nature of society and the history of America. I haven't previously thought of Anderson as a political filmmaker. He isn't someone to make bold or obvious political statements. Instead, he weaves them into the fabric of his films. He may not be an obviously political filmmaker, but the politics is there beneath the surface. It is easy to make sweeping statements about money, power, and religion when discussing There Will Be Blood. It's that all these statements feel reductive when compared with the film itself that truly illustrates its greatness. The Master. At its center, The Master asks a simple question. Where can troubled people find community and meaning? When we first see Freddie Quell, played by Joaquin Phoenix, he is a sailor returning from the Second World War. He and his fellow veterans undergo some very rudimentary psychological tests before being sent back to civilian life. At least for Freddie, this transition doesn't go smoothly. There is no support system in place for him. He spends time as a photographer and a farmer, but is mostly just an aimless drunk. It is in this vacuum that Freddie falls into the cause, a cult resembling Scientology. It is led by the charismatic Lancaster Dodd, played by Philip Seymour Hoffman. In many ways, The Master is the culmination of Anderson's career-long look at found families. To give the cause some credit, they give Freddie a bed and the opportunity to express his feelings. Its practices feel like a warped version of psychotherapy, as if Freud was filtered through Carl Sagan and New Age mysticism. The problem is that their beliefs are based on Dodd's questionable writings. Dodd speaks about our souls being trillions of years old, and when questioned, spews verbal abuse. At one point, his editor even says he's a grade A mystic. The cause's treatment practices seem to do more damage than good to those who undergo them. Freddie is frequently humiliated and reminded of his lost love Doris. When he questions Dodd, Dodd retorts, "I'm the only one who likes you, you drunk." It is hard to know how much Freddie really recovers over the course of the film. In the film's final shot, we see Freddie next to a sandcastle of a naked woman, mirroring a scene early in the film. The irony of Dodd as a character is that the more he promises, the more impossible his situation becomes. The more he needs to belittle and control those around him in order to maintain his authority. It presents a fascinating counterbalance to the nostalgia of the post-war years. The idea of post-war prosperity and opportunity has shaped politics and society for the last 70 years. The iconography of Eisenhower's America has become a political battleground. The Master shows the unequal nature of this ideal. It shows those who are left behind, those who are exploited and manipulated for its advancement, those who seek answers in the wrong places. It presents a troubling truth about our society and our politics. In The Master, the lack of emotional support and psychological understanding gives space to lies and charlatans to rise. A postmodern streak runs through much of Anderson's work, and it can again be seen here. Dodd's pursuit of fundamental truth, at one point he promises the source of all creation, is seen as hollow and fraudulent. Dodd's son Val at one point even says, "He's making this all up as he goes along. Don't you see that?" While the influence of postmodern literature would become more apparent with Anderson's next film, Inherent Vice, The Master's questioning of fundamental truth and social hierarchy as well as its presentation of fragmented identities, shows Anderson already drawing from the work of Thomas Pynchon and Don DeLillo. As ever, Anderson is drawing from different films and filmmakers as well. The early part of the film, where the veterans are being readied for civilian life, takes inspiration and sometimes dialogue from John Huston's documentary, Let There Be Light. This is the first time I see shades of Stanley Kubrick in Anderson. There's something hypnotic about the film. It can be abstract and dreamy, but is always captivating. It is weird in a way that only Anderson could pull off. The idea of Dodd singing On a Slow Boat to China on paper sounds ridiculous, but in reality is oddly affecting. I don't think Anderson gets enough credit for just how strange his films can sometimes be. I personally see The Master as Anderson's greatest work and as one of the defining films of this century. It is an exquisite, hypnotic piece of filmmaking. There are very few films that can rival its brilliance. Inherent Vice. When I first saw Inherent Vice, I didn't know what to make of it. This was quite a common response. Contemporary reviews described it as both brilliant and confounding. Watching the film again a decade later, I found Inherent Vice to not just be more enjoyable, it can be very funny at times, but also much deeper. I won't even try to summarize the plot, which is adapted from the Thomas Pynchon novel of the same name. Inherent Vice makes The Big Sleep seem easy to follow. More important than the plot is the context it takes place in. Larry Doc Sportello, played by Joaquin Phoenix, is a hippie private detective who has found himself out of time. The idealism of the 1960s counterculture has faded, and the LAPD, neo-Nazi groups, corporate businesses, and the conservative politics of Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan are ready to swoop in. There are many Anderson films that take place at turning points in history. We've already seen this with Boogie Nights, There Will Be Blood, and The Master. But with Inherent Vice, which is set in 1970, he is examining a very specific moment. We see Richard Nixon on television and hear mentions of Governor Reagan's shutdown of state mental facilities. Charles Manson is mentioned multiple times as well. In some ways, Inherent Vice could act as a thematic sequel to Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, where Tarantino's film, set a year earlier in 1969, looks at the end of the 1960s dream. Inherent Vice looks at its aftermath. Doc sees disdain for hippies wherever he goes. His one-time love interest, Shasta, even describes him at one point as a dirty, filthy hippie. When real estate developer Mickey Wolfman is finally tracked down by Doc, Wolfman tells him, "You're helping me wake up from my bad hippie dream." Towards the end of the film, Inherent Vice is directly mentioned. It is defined in relation to maritime law as anything that cannot be avoided. By the time Pynchon's novel came out, we had already seen the presidencies of Reagan and 2 George Bushes. The hippie ideals of love and freedom had very much been replaced by the conservative takeover of cultural and political institutions. Despite all that, it is still possible to do the right thing. When a money reward is offered, Doc instead decides to do a selfless act. He uses his leverage not for personal gain, but to allow a friend he's made during his investigation to be reunited with his family. Beneath Inherent Vice's drug-filled haze lies a surprisingly simple and sincere message. Phantom Thread. On first viewing, Phantom Thread was the Anderson film I didn't quite get. I very much saw it as a minor film from a great director. Weirdly, I think part of the problem was that I saw it in a packed cinema. Phantom Thread has its share of funny moments. Reynolds' Woodcock, played by Daniel Day-Lewis, can be ridiculous, and the laughter in the cinema took me out of the mood of the film. Perhaps more than any other Anderson film, Phantom Thread is about mood and feeling. The first half almost feels like a chamber piece, with the camera gliding from room to room. The second feels more like a psychodrama, with tensions building between Reynolds and Alma. I can't quite decide if Phantom Thread is about class. Reynolds has the kind of mannered voice that sounds like it's hiding more humble beginnings. His place in high society feels conditional. It is based on his ability to produce beautiful dresses, rather than being something he was born into. Reynolds is allowed to feel important and valuable, but only if he keeps working. Alma, played by Vicky Krieps, is more grounded than Reynolds. She's less concerned with appearances and the opinions of others. At one point, Reynolds and Alma attend a posh party, where Alma's less refined manners lead to her being described as rude and like a toddler. At the same time, the relationship between Reynolds and Alma is very much at the centre of Phantom Thread. Reynolds is demanding in particular. It is implied that there is a long line of women who came before Alma, who Reynolds fell for, tired of, and discarded. Alma breaks this cycle, becoming a more permanent figure in the Woodcock household. She interrupts Reynolds' routine and challenges his way of life. Towards the end of the film, she says, "I want you flat on your back, helpless, tender, open, with only me to help." It's a dynamic that allows Anderson to examine the intricacies of love and relationships, the desire for control, and the need to release in order to truly let someone in. For me, this is Anderson's most Kubrickian film, aside from Reynolds driving, which visually mirrors similar scenes in A Clockwork Orange. Phantom Thread's lush camera work reminds me of Barry Lyndon, and its examination of the inner workings of relationships brings to mind Eyes Wide Shut. It is also his most Hitchcockian. There are definitely shades of Vertigo and Rebecca to Phantom Thread. The score from Johnny Greenwood is exquisite. It is delicate and gives shape and emotional depth to the film. It might actually be my favourite of his scores. I haven't mentioned him up until this point, but he has scored every Anderson film since There Will Be Blood. There is a strong argument to be made that he is Anderson's most important collaborator. While it took me a while to truly appreciate Phantom Thread, I can now see why it is often ranked among Anderson's best films. It is perhaps his most emotionally rich film, and is the kind of film that could only be made by a true craftsman. Licorice Pizza. I've been amazed at how well Anderson's films have held up. Up until this point, I've enjoyed them at least as much as I did on first watch, and in many cases I found new depth and complexity to them. Licorice Pizza is the exception to this. I can remember really enjoying it on first watch, but this time round thought it was just decent, a word not often assigned to Anderson's work. If there is any Anderson film that deserves the minor film from a great director label, it is probably this one. I still enjoyed Licorice Pizza, and there is plenty of great filmmaking here, but at the same time it felt like something was missing. If I had one criticism of Anderson, it is that his writing method has become a bit obvious. Between Punch Drunk Love and Licorice Pizza, all his films, inherent vice aside, were based around contrasting characters coming together and disrupting each other's lives. I wonder with Licorice Pizza if Anderson had taken this formula as far as it can go. There is a lack of tension and drama between the two leads. Alana and Gary basically get on. The will they won't they dynamic isn't always enough to keep things moving. Quite a few reviews have described the film as freewheeling. A less charitable description would be meandering. At the same time, this is still an Anderson film. There are several brilliant sequences, in particular the one where the van rolls backwards down the Los Angeles hills, and an interesting core idea. Licorice Pizza does effectively describe the ambiguous line between childhood and adulthood. It makes sense that the film's structure is so loose, given the number of false starts and dead ends that characterize early adulthood. In many ways, Gary, played by Cooper Hoffman, has a better idea of what he wants and what his future holds than Alana, played by Alana Haim, despite their 10-year age gap. In that sense, it is natural that they end up hanging out. There is a sense throughout the film that what we think the future will be is often misguided. This is perhaps best shown when Alana volunteers for a mayoral political campaign, one that has more than a passing resemblance to the one in Taxi Driver. She patronizingly says to Gary, "You're talking about pinball machines. I'm a politician." In the end, she ends up being used to help cover up the candidate's sexuality, while Gary's pinball venture is a success. Gary's business plans may seem impulsive and silly, but they show an initiative and confidence that will set him up well for adult life. It is never explicitly mentioned, but Gary is already supporting his family. His father is absent and never even mentioned, Between his acting jobs and entrepreneurial pursuits, he is able to look after his mother and younger brother. I actually wish this part of the film was explored further. I'd be lying if I said I loved Licorice Pizza, but I can at least see what Anderson is trying to do and appreciate the elements of the film that do work. Licorice Pizza might be a minor Anderson film, but that is no insult. One battle after another. I saw One Battle After Another last night and really enjoyed it. I will admit, after carefully rewatching all of Anderson's previous films, I feel a little on the spot having to discuss his latest while I'm still formulating my thoughts on it. Over the last couple of years, there have been a few long, ambitious films, Oppenheimer, Killers of the Flower Moon, The Brutalist, that have received particular praise. After watching each of them, I had a similar reaction. I knew they were very good, but I also knew that I needed to watch them again to know if they were truly great. That's where I currently stand with One Battle After Another. I know it's very good. It will just take time for me to decide whether it is great. At least for now, I will hold back on some of the superlatives that have been lavished upon it. I spoke earlier about Anderson hiding politics within the subtext of his work. At least on the surface, One Battle After Another is his most overtly political film. It concerns itself with far-left political activists, a secret society of white supremacists, and morally questionable military officers. At one point, the streets erupt in flames as troops battle against protesters. At the same time, it is family and the impact that political action has upon it that holds the film together. Where films like The Master and There Will Be Blood are character studies that allude to broader political messages, One Battle After Another looks at how relationships and lives are disrupted by the political situations around them. It raises the question of how do we engage with the world around us? Do we numb ourselves with drugs and alcohol like Bob Ferguson, played by Leonardo DiCaprio? Or do we rage war with the world and have to live in exile like Perfidia, played by Tiana Taylor? In truth, neither of these approaches seem productive. Perhaps Sergio, a karate teacher, played by Benicio del Toro, is the best example for us to follow. It is only alluded to in passing, but he is providing refuge to a community of undocumented migrants, not just giving them somewhere to sleep, but also protecting them from the authorities. It's a thoughtful counterpoint to the armed attacks and bombings that open the film. When Anderson previously adapted Thomas Pynchon, One Battle After Another is at least in part inspired by Pynchon's novel Vineland. He found a surprisingly sincere message at its core. Beneath the car crashes and action, maybe the same goes for One Battle After Another. Perhaps the best kind of political action is caring for your loved ones and supporting your community, whatever that might look like. I actually see the title as optimistic. The world may not be the place we want it to be, but the battle isn't over, and there'll be plenty more opportunities to challenge power and change the world for the better. It'll take some more time and likely another viewing for me to truly appreciate One Battle After Another. For now, it is definitely one of the better films of the year, and another bold film from Anderson that reminds us once again what a singular talent he is. It has been an absolute joy going through all of Paul Thomas Anderson's films. As a young cinephile, I boldly proclaimed Anderson as the defining American filmmaker of his generation. Almost 15 years later, I stand by that statement. He has put together a Kubrick-like filmography where every film is significant and proclaimed by some as his masterwork. I don't think he gets enough credit for making distinct, original films. Filmmakers of this distinction don't come around that often. In time, I believe we will see Anderson spoken of in the same breath as Kubrick and Scorsese. It is a true joy to be a cinephile at a time when Paul Thomas Anderson is making films.